A short-order cook in a New Jersey roadside diner could feed the graveyard shift of a Campbell's soup factory in under an hour, and he never wrote down a ticket. He worked the grill like a piano player, the chalkboard like a marquee, and the line never broke from midnight to dawn. Number 22 on this list was invented in a Fall River mill town for a nickel. Number 17 fed truckers off Interstate 490 at 2 in the morning. Number 4 on this list vanished the year the chains stopped baking pie. These 25 meals were not restaurant food. They were counter food, chalkboard food, graveyard shift food, served on chrome stools and chipped porcelain coast to coast. Subscribe before we count down, because the diners that fed your father are mostly gone too. Here are the 25 diner meals that made America famous and then disappeared forever. Number 25. The open-faced hot turkey sandwich. 2 slices of Wonder Bread on a chipped white plate, lapped over with sliced turkey from a roaster the cook pulled at 5 in the morning, then drowned in brown gravy from the same pan. A scoop of mashed potato sat on the side like a small white island. The Worcester Lunch Car Company shipped diners up the eastern seaboard from 1906 to 1957, and almost every single one ran a hot turkey commercial as the Tuesday $4 special. You ate it with a fork because the bread was already soup, and the cook used the carcass for stock the next morning, and that stock went into the Wednesday gravy. By 1985, the dish had slipped off most chalkboards. Carving stations in chain restaurants killed the volume, and the cooks who could break down a roaster in 12 minutes flat retired into Florida. Number 24. The hot beef commercial. In southwestern Minnesota, you did not say beef sandwich. You said commercial, the way your father said it and his father before him. The dish was a hot turkey's older cousin, built on commercial-grade beef from the back of the cooler, sliced thin, piled on white bread, smothered in gravy thick as cement. By the 1910s, every small-town diner from Mankato to the Black Hills served one. Traveling salesmen called them commercial men back then, and the sandwich took its name from the hotel restaurants where they slept by the railroad tracks. $3 in 1968 bought you the plate, the mashed potatoes, and a cup of coffee. But the dish stayed alive in southern Minnesota into the 1990s and then quietly vanished off the bigger menus, kept on life support today by a few VFW kitchens between Mankato and the South Dakota line. Number 23. The Blue Plate Special. Catering man Fred Harvey is credited with the format in the 1870s along the Santa Fe Railroad, but the diners are what made it American. A divided porcelain plate, often blue, with 1 square for meat, 1 for potatoes, 2 for vegetables, and a slice of bread tucked under the gravy like a tile. The whole rotation was written in chalk above the pass, and you ordered by pointing. Meatloaf on Monday, fried chicken on Tuesday, Salisbury steak on Wednesday, fish on Friday, pot roast on Saturday. By 1955, you could eat a blue plate in any of more than 6,000 diners across the country for under $1. And the plate itself disappeared first, replaced by oval crockery that stacked tighter in the dishwasher. The rotation followed by 1980. Today, you can buy the original divided blue plate on eBay for $40 and find the dinner that went on it almost nowhere. Number 22. The chow mein sandwich. A Cantonese immigrant named Frederick Wong arrived in this country in 1926, joined his uncle's kitchen in Fall River, Massachusetts, and in 1938 founded the Oriental Chow Mine Company on 8th Street. The mill workers in that textile town would not order chow mein on a plate, so the cooks ladled the brown gravy and crispy noodles between 2 halves of a hamburger bun and called it a sandwich. It cost a nickel during the Depression. By the 1950s, every Chinese-American counter in southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island served one, and the noodles came in a paper bag from Wong's plant down the street. The mills closed. The Chinese-American counters thinned out. Today, only a handful of places in Fall River still serve it, and Me Some restaurant has been doing so for more than 50 years on the same corner. Most of the country has never even heard of it. Number 21. Chipped beef on toast. Soldiers and sailors called it SOS, and the Army Cookbook of 1910 was the first to print the recipe in plain block letters. Dried beef chopped fine like confetti, stirred into a milk and flour gravy, ladled over a single slice of toast on a steel mess tray. The veterans came home from the Pacific and Europe in 1945 and asked for it in their hometown diners, and by 1952, every counter from Pittsburgh to Sacramento ran it as a breakfast special. The Navy nicknamed the dish for words we will not say on this channel. Diners cleaned the name up to creamed chipped beef and sold it for 60 cents with 2 eggs and a side of fried potatoes. Then McDonald's launched the Egg McMuffin in 1972, and the whole breakfast crowd started moving toward windows instead of counters. By 1990, SOS was gone from almost every diner menu, and the rest of America forgot what those 3 letters stood for. Number 20. Salisbury steak. Dr. James Henry Salisbury fed Civil War Union soldiers a hot water and ground beef cure for camp dysentery, and 20 years later he published the regimen in 1885 under his own name. The dish that came out of his clinic was a seasoned hamburger patty pressed flat, browned, and finished in mushroom onion gravy. Diners picked it up because it cost less than steak and looked like steak on the plate. By the 1950s, Salisbury was on every cafeteria line, every army mess, every TV dinner tray Swanson sold at the supermarket. A 1962 menu out of Indianapolis priced the plate at $1.10 with 2 sides. The dish survived in TV dinners longer than it survived on diner counters. Banquet still sells it frozen. The hot version on a chipped plate with a side of canned peas is almost extinct now, kept alive only in a few rural truck stops and the dining rooms of nursing homes where you can still order it the way your grandfather did in 1959. Number 19. Chicken croquettes. Diner cooks called them the great recyclers. Yesterday's chicken or turkey, shredded by hand into a bowl of cream sauce, rolled into cylinders the size of a roll of nickels, breaded, and dropped into the deep fryer. They came out the color of pine bark and stood up on the plate next to mashed potatoes and a pool of gravy. A chicken croquette dinner at the Forum Cafeteria chain in 1957 cost 85 cents and came with 2 vegetables and a roll. They were the practical answer to a roaster the kitchen could not sell a second time, and they were a classy plate at a Mother's Day Sunday lunch, sometimes both on the same week in the same kitchen. Then chicken fingers showed up on the kids' menu in the 1980s, and the croquette was finished. The shape was wrong. The fryer was the same. The customer had simply moved on. Number 18. The slinger. The Powers family of Eat Right diners in St. Louis claimed the dish was born in their Fenton store in the 1970s. A Texas trucker walked in at 3 in the morning and asked for chili on his eggs. The 2 waitresses, instead of explaining the whole order to the cook, started yelling, "Sling it at the pass." What landed on the plate was 2 eggs, hash browns, a hamburger patty, all buried under chili, shredded cheddar, and raw onions. The Eat Right on Chouteau Avenue stood on a corner of Old Route 66 with a neon sign that ran day and night. Truckers, third-shift hospital workers, and bar closers ate the slinger off a counter wrapped in stainless steel. $2.50 in 1978, $4 by 1995, and you ate it with a paper napkin tucked into your collar because the chili ran. The slinger never quite traveled beyond the city limits. Number 17. The garbage plate. Alexander Tahu, a Greek immigrant, opened West Main Texas Hots in Rochester, New York in 1918. By the 1940s, his son Nick had renamed it Nick Tahu Hots, and the dish at the heart of the menu was a pile of home fries, macaroni salad, baked beans, and 2 of whatever meat you wanted, all on the same plate, drowned in a dark hot sauce the family kept secret. College students in the mid-1980s asked Nick for the plate with all the garbage on it, and the name stuck. The family trademarked the term in 1992. Truck drivers pulling off Interstate 490 at 2 in the morning could fill themselves up for under $5 and roll back into the cab fed for 8 hours. The dish never escaped Rochester. Tahu's still serves it on the original West Main location. Imitators across upstate New York call it a plate, a trash plate, or a hot plate because the name is owned, and one Greek-American family still owns it. Number 16. Scrapple. A pale gray loaf, sliced thin, pan-fried until the edges shattered like a potato chip, served at a Pennsylvania diner counter with 2 over-easy eggs and a pool of king syrup. Joshua Haberset opened the first Scrapple plant in Middletown Township, Delaware County in 1863, and Haberset still controls about half of the Philadelphia market today. The dish came over with the German colonists in the 1700s, built from cornmeal, wheat, buckwheat, and the pork scraps a butcher could not otherwise sell. From the 1920s through the 1970s, almost every diner from Philadelphia to Lancaster ran Scrapple next to eggs. The country breakfast crowd got smaller. Outside of the Pennsylvania Dutch counties and the Delaware Valley, you can no longer find a slice of Scrapple on any diner griddle in America. Number 15. Liver and onions. Cast iron, a 1/4 inch of bacon grease, calf's liver dredged in seasoned flour, and a heap of yellow onions that had been on the flat top long enough to caramelize but not burn. The plate came with mashed potatoes and a small puddle of pan gravy made from the fond. Through the late 1940s and the 1950s, every roadside diner from Hartford to Houston ran liver and onions as a Thursday special. It was cheap, it was iron-rich, and the doctors of the day told mothers to feed it to children twice a week. The post-war economy boomed. Steak landed on more plates. The kids who grew up on liver in 1955 quietly refused to order it in 1975 the way you refused canned spinach. By 1985, the dish had vanished from most counters, and per capita liver consumption in this country fell off a cliff like a rock off a ledge. A handful of family diners in Pennsylvania and the Midwest still keep it on the chalkboard for the regulars who would walk out without it. Number 14. Calf brains and eggs. St. Louis diners, Cleveland diners, and the South Philadelphia counters ran this special on Saturday morning straight through the 1960s. The cook poached the brains in salted water, pulled them apart with a fork like a soft custard, and scrambled them into eggs with butter and black pepper on the flat top. The plate came with rye toast cut on the bias and a wedge of dill pickle. Working men ordered it before a Saturday shift because it was cheap, filling, and the meat counter was almost giving the brains away by the pound. Then bovine spongiform encephalopathy hit the news in 1986, and inside 10 years, calf brains were off every public menu in the country. But the dish did not decline the way liver did. It was banned, in effect, by the FDA-driven Specified Risk Material Rule of 1997. Today, you cannot legally serve beef brains in an American restaurant. The cook who could finish a brain scramble in under 3 minutes is in his 80s now, and his apron hangs on a nail in a kitchen that closed in 2003. The Saturday line at the South Philadelphia counter that ran from 6 to 10 in the morning, with rye toast stacked in a bin and a coffee urn the size of a fire hydrant, ended on the day the last cook hung up his apron and the regulars never came back. A whole regional Saturday breakfast disappeared inside a single decade, and your grandfather's idea of a working man's eggs went with it. The dish was once on the same chalkboard as bacon and eggs, in the same diner, on the same Saturday morning. Now it is on no chalkboard in any city in America, and the FDA paperwork that ended it sits in a federal register no one has read. Number 13. Beef tongue on rye. The Jewish delicatessen diners of New York and Chicago stocked tongue in a brine pot for 2 weeks, then simmered it for 4 hours, peeled the skin, and sliced it across the grain in petal-thin pieces. The sandwich came on seeded rye with deli mustard and a half-sour pickle in a cardboard cup of vinegar brine. A Second Avenue deli ticket from 1972 priced the plate at $2.95 with a side of slaw. By the year 2000, most diners had pulled tongue off the menu because the labor was high and the customer was nervous. The Second Avenue deli still serves it. Most counters do not. A New York lunch tradition that ran from the 1880s to the late 1990s ended for the simple reason that the next generation could not look at the muscle in the case and order it by name. Number 12. Pickled pig's feet. A glass jar on the back counter full of pink-tinged vinegar brine and pale split trotters that had been simmered for 6 hours and then cured for a week. A nickel apiece during the Depression, a quarter through the 1950s. The dish came out of poor southern kitchens, traveled north with the Great Migration, and landed on the back counter of every working-class diner from Memphis to Detroit. Truck drivers ate them out of the jar with a paper napkin. Mill hands took them home in a paper bag. The dish was never a sit-down plate. It was a snack you bought between shifts, a piece of something the butcher could not otherwise sell. But by the 1980s, health departments wrote new rules on open jar service, and the back-counter pickled foot economy disappeared. This is where the diner economy starts to make sense. The chrome stool, the chalkboard, and the back-counter jar were not nostalgia in their own time. They were the cheapest way a working person could eat a hot meal between two shifts, and the cook on the other side of the counter knew everyone by their first name and their order. When the union jobs left town, the shift schedules went with them, and the diners that fed the nightmen went too. The food disappeared because the work disappeared. Number 11. Head cheese. Cleveland diners, Pittsburgh counters, and Polish-American luncheonettes in Chicago and Buffalo all ran a head cheese plate through the 1960s. A pig's head simmered for 9 hours in a stock pot heavy with bay, peppercorn, and clove. The cook picked the meat and the gelatin, packed it into a loaf pan, weighted it overnight with a brick wrapped in foil, and sliced it cold the next morning. The plate came with rye, mustard, a slice of raw onion, and a pickled tomato. $3 in 1965 bought you the plate and a cup of coffee. The dish was on the menu of working-class neighborhoods because the head, by weight, was the cheapest cut a butcher sold. Industrial pork moved to boxed primal cuts in the 1970s. The whole head economy ended. Outside of a few Polish butcher counters in northern Indiana and one or two old-line delis in Chicago, head cheese is gone. Your great-uncle ate it, you probably never will. Number 10. The chow mein dinner. A platter of celery, onion, sliced mushroom, and bean sprout in a brown cornstarch gravy, with a side of crispy chow mein noodles in a small basket on top, all served over a heap of white rice with a metal can of soy sauce on the table. From the 1920s through the 1970s, a chow mein dinner was the most common Chinese plate in any American diner that ran a Cantonese kitchen on the side. The big can of canned chow mein with mostly bean sprout and a teaspoon of chicken sat on every Howard Johnson's shelf in 1955. By the late 1970s, real-deal Sichuan and Hunan menus arrived in the cities, and the diner-style chow mein was suddenly an embarrassment. The dish slid off the menu of nearly every American counter inside 10 years. The bean sprout and brown gravy survives only in a few Midwestern small towns where the menu has not changed since 1968. Number 9. The cherry phosphate. A soda jerk in a long white apron stood behind a marble counter at a Walgreens lunch counter in 1922 with two pumps in front of him like organ pedals. One pump held cherry syrup. The other held a clear, slightly sour solution called acid phosphate. He pulled an inch of each into a tall, fluted glass, filled it from the seltzer tap, and slid it across the marble for a nickel. The phosphate gave the soda a clean, dry finish that masked the sweetness. Soda fountains served cherry, lemon, raspberry, and chocolate phosphates from the 1880s straight through the 1930s. Then, the soda fountains gave up the marble counter for an ice cream parlor format. The acid phosphate fell out of pharmaceutical supply chains by 1950. A small revival started around 2015 in a few craft soda shops. For most of America, the dry, clean cherry phosphate is a drink that simply no longer exists, and your grandmother's first taste of carbonated cherry is one you can no longer order. Number 8. The lime Ricky. A glass of seltzer, 2 ounces of lime juice from a fresh fruit, and a tablespoon of plain or raspberry cherry syrup stirred at the counter with a long iced teaspoon. A bartender named George Williamson invented the cocktail version in 1883 in Washington, but the soda fountain version arrived a decade later and held a generation. The drink survived Prohibition because it had no alcohol in it. Diner counters in New England and New York ran it from the 1910s through the 1960s as a fountain special. Then, home refrigeration arrived, and packaged sodas in 10-cent cans pushed the Ricky off the menu. Brigham's in Boston kept it on the menu into the 1990s. A handful of New York egg cream counters kept it. Outside of those few last counters, the Ricky is a drink almost nobody under 60 has tasted, the green color of summer in a glass. Number 7. The Horn and Hardart Automat Plate. Joseph Horn and Frank Hardart opened the first automat in Philadelphia in 1902 with German equipment imported from Berlin. By 1950, the chain was serving 500,000 cups of coffee a day, and at peak more than 800,000 patrons a day walked the marble lobbies of New York and Philadelphia automats. The plate was simple: macaroni and cheese behind a small chrome window, beef pie behind another, creamed spinach behind another. The customer dropped a nickel in a slot, turned a brass knob, and the window opened. By 1962, the suburban diners and drive-through chains had pulled the lunch crowd out of the city, and the automat coin-operated economy could no longer cover its rent. The last New York automat closed in 1991. Half a century of urban lunch culture vanished, and your grandmother's first restaurant meal in this country probably came out of one of those chrome windows. Number 6. The Cottage Cheese and Peach Half. A scoop of cottage cheese in a glass dish, a single canned peach half, a maraschino cherry on top, a leaf of iceberg lettuce on the side. From 1955 into the late 1970s, this was the reducing plate, and it sat on every Denny's, Sambo's, and Howard Johnson's menu in the country. A 1967 Denny's menu listed it for 50 cents. A 1975 Denny's menu put it inside a lean and low section near the back of the laminated card. Working women ate it at the lunch counter in pairs. Salesmen ate it standing at the counter on the road. But the salad bar arrived in the early 1980s and gave the same small lunch with 5 times the volume, and the cottage cheese plate slid off the menu inside 3 years. Your mother probably ordered it at least once. Your daughter has never seen it. If this list is bringing your father's lunch break back to you, share which dish hit the hardest in the comments below. The diners are mostly gone. The recipes are still on an index card in someone's kitchen. Number 5. Chop suey, the dish that no one in China ever made. American chop suey was bean sprouts, celery, water chestnut, and slivers of pork or chicken, all bound in a brown cornstarch gravy and served over white rice. Chinese-American countercooks built the recipe in the late 19th century to feed mining camps and railroad gangs in California, then sold it to the rest of the country as authentic. By 1955, it was on every diner with a Chinese menu insert from coast to coast, and on the canned food shelf at every grocery store under the La Choy and Chun King labels. A chop suey plate at Howard Johnson's in 1962 cost $1.25. The Sichuan and Hunan kitchens of the late 1970s shamed the dish off the menu. The cooks who could time the cornstarch gravy by sound retired. The plate followed by 1990, and your grandfather's first taste of Chinese food is no longer a Chinese dish at all. Number 4. Pie a la mode. Charles Watson Townsend at the Cambridge Hotel in upstate New York is credited with the order in the 1890s when he asked a waitress for ice cream on his apple pie. The dish swept onto every diner pie counter inside a decade like a wildfire across dry grass. From 1920 to 1980, almost every American diner kept a glass-domed pie carousel turning at the counter with 8 wedges, and almost every wedge that left the counter went out a la mode. The peak of pie a la mode was the early 1950s. 20 cents got you the wedge and the scoop in 1948. $3 got it in 1985. The carousel went next. The wedge of homemade pie sliding under a single hard scoop of vanilla disappeared from the chain restaurants first, then the family diners, kept alive only in a few backroad counters where the pie still came out of an oven in the kitchen. Number 3. The diner meatloaf plate. 2 thick slices of meatloaf on white china, mashed potatoes pressed into a small volcano with a pat of butter melting in the crater like lava, a ladle of pan gravy that ran down both sides, and a side of canned green beans or buttered peas. Worcester Lunch Car Company diners ran it as the Monday special from 1930 to 1950. Howard Johnson's ran it as a daily staple. A Greek-owned counter in Astoria, Queens, served 3,000 of them a year in the 1960s. The meatloaf plate at most counters topped out at $1.95 in 1968. By the 1990s, the plate had shrunk to nothing. The chain restaurants kept the word on the menu, but the meatloaf was now made from a sealed bag delivered on a truck. The diner version, hand-pressed in a loaf pan with onion and ketchup glaze, finished its long run on the same plate your father grew up eating it from. Number 2. The diner egg cream. 2 ounces of cold whole milk in a tall fluted glass, a half-inch of Fox's You Bet chocolate syrup at the bottom, the rest filled from a seltzer line at high pressure to whip a brown foam to the rim. No egg in it, no cream in it. The name was a 100-year mystery. Brooklyn candy stores and Lower East Side diners served the egg cream from the 1890s into the 1980s as the most New York drink that ever lived. A nickel got it in 1925. A quarter got it in 1962. Then the seltzer line started to go out of the diners as fountain Coke arrived from a corporate dispenser, and the syrup line fell behind. Fox's still bottles the You Bet syrup at the same Brooklyn plant. Most New York diners no longer pull a seltzer and syrup egg cream. The drink survives in 3 or 4 counters in Brooklyn and almost nowhere else. Number 1. The rotating glass pie case. The slow-turning glass tower at the end of the counter that held 12 wedges of pie, the carousel light bulb glowing yellow inside, the cherry, lemon meringue, banana cream, and chocolate cream slowly passing the eye on a small motor at the base. Every Worcester lunch car company diner shipped between 1930 and 1955 came with one. Every Pullman-style diner had one. The case held the wedges that had been baked at 4 in the morning by the same cook who would cut them at midnight. The waitress turned the case by hand if the motor seized, and a dime tip kept her in white aprons. By the year 2000, the cases had been pulled out of most diners and sold to antique stores for $200 apiece. The pie that turned in them is now ordered from a wholesale bakery in a frozen plastic clamshell. The slow rotating yellow tower at the counter with 12 wedges and the smell of vanilla and butter on the glass is the single thing on this list your grandchildren will never see. Yes, stuffed pigeons with chestnuts were something that people actually did regularly reserve for their tables for Sunday roasts. And yes, this is definitely gluttony. Not bordering on the edge, not a stone's throw away, just pure, unadulterated gluttony. Stuffed pigeons were a traditional dish that were brought onto American kitchens primarily through immigrant communities. By this I mean, you can once again curse the British for their food. I really don't get what goes on in the kitchens in that country. It feels like every step they take is like playing Russian roulette because will they take a step forward? Will they set us back a decade or two? You may never know. Anyway, the chestnut thing was actually something that was brought into the equation thanks to the French. Apparently, chestnuts are a pretty popular stuffing in the region there. It makes sense that we tried things like this since in the middle half of the 20th century, all we ever did was delve as deep as possible into European cooking. Thing is, this dish was only possible because people regularly kept pigeons and raised them on their farms and in their living spaces. Thanks to the mass amount of urbanization, your typical 2-bed in New York just doesn't come equipped with pigeon-raising facilities these days. Carrot and raisin salad brought color and sweetness to Thanksgiving tables without requiring expensive ingredients or complicated preparation that strained budgets. Carrots were peeled and grated by hand using box graters, creating thin shreds that mixed easily with plump raisins that had been soaked briefly in warm water to soften them. The dressing was simply mayonnaise, thinned with a little vinegar and sugar, coating the carrots until they glistened orange and inviting in serving bowls. Some cooks added shredded cabbage to stretch the salad further, while others included chopped celery for additional crunch and volume. The result was sweet, tangy, and refreshing, providing textural contrast to heavier holiday foods while adding vitamins that struggling families needed. Children particularly loved this salad because the raisins offered little bursts of candy-like sweetness hidden among the vegetables. A pound of carrots and small box of raisins created enough salad for 12 people. So it's not like the 70s were just a period of bad eating, bombastic food, and a lot of good music. It was also the age of fusion food. Ramen stir-fry kind of comes out of this sort of environment. Seriously, people were doing nothing if not experimenting like mad scientists. They were mixing up every food and recipe known to man in an attempt to crack the code at finding the perfect next big thing. Ramen stir-fry. Despite how bad people wanted it to live up to their expectations of the next big thing, could not be that, unfortunately. The idea was to take instant ramen noodles and mix them up with the usual assortment of vegetables you see in most stir-fries. And for a time, that worked, but it just wasn't really innovative enough. I mean, ramen on its own already had a decent amount of vegetables and non-meat-related toppings in the broth. The ramen stir-fry that was being made was sort of an attempt to mimic a vegetable-based pasta dish, but it was just okay. Like, nothing spectacular. People still make it for casual snacks and food, and that's pretty much how it was conceived back then too. Spiced honey-glazed ham was a special one. It was one of the first few instances we had of spicy glazes or glazes in general being used in popular mainstream American traditions. Something breaking into the platform of Sunday roasts, potlucks, casserole Mondays, and church potlucks was always a big thing. It was basically the 20th century equivalent of someone getting a contract with the NBA right out of high school or landing a Tarantino production. It was your big break, your way to get your name out there in the industry. Dishes like these were some of the first things in the world that ever popularized honey glazes, which were really just a European concept for the most part until they became as big as they are now in America. Also, people just got tired of having the same old ham they were always used to. You need to switch things up, man. Keep it interesting. Take yourself out to a dinner you really like, and ham just isn't it. I mean, for breakfast, comfort food days, and intense cravings, I'm right there with you. But there's no sense in sticking to tradition so much you ignore the good ideas out there, right? Would you say you're the type to experiment? And if so, are glazes something you'd play around with? Mashed potato casserole turned yesterday's leftovers into tomorrow's Thanksgiving side dish, embodying the waste-nothing philosophy that governed 1960s kitchens and family budgets. Cold mashed potatoes were mixed with a beaten egg to bind them together, spread evenly in a buttered baking dish, and topped with breadcrumbs made from dried bread crust that had been saved throughout the week. The casserole baked until the top turned golden and crispy, while the potatoes underneath stayed creamy and smooth, creating textural contrast that made it more interesting than plain mashed potatoes served fresh. Some cooks added diced onions or grated cheese when available, but the basic version required only potatoes, egg, and crumbs to create something worthy of holiday tables. The dish stretched limited resources by making day-old potatoes feel new and special rather than boring leftovers. Families prepared it the morning of Thanksgiving and baked it while the main dishes cooked, saving precious time and oven space. Baked ziti is still, on the other hand, something I would say does get a lot of action, even today though. Sometimes these American trends confuse the life out of me. Like, I just don't get why baked ziti would outpace shredded pork tacos, you know? It doesn't make sense. It's like saying you'd expect, I don't know, U2 to outlast Coldplay. I mean, sure, maybe I'm on the younger side when I say this, but U2 had some hits. Coldplay, though? That's kind of my outlook on the whole situation. If you think baked ziti deserves to be in the 2020s with us more than some other items on the list, feel free to disagree, and actually, disagree pretty loudly in the comments. Back to baked ziti, though. So here you have your usual pasta cheese affair, which seems to be a combination that, across all ages, Americans can't seem to get enough of. It's cheap, it's economical, and it's definitely healthy. Still, it's bland, a bit uninspiring, and, well, just overdone. This is also why you don't see most people making baked zitis outside of 30-something suburban moms. So, roasted quail with grapes was what you get for the missus on a special night on the town, or maybe it would be the 14th of February and you wanted to make an impression. Maybe the occasion was severely special, or maybe you just had a lot more money than you knew what to do with and you were bored. The thing that remains consistent in all cases is that you always needed to look like you came from money if you were having this dish. You may not really think too much of it, at least I know I didn't for the longest while, but there are even financial barriers to trying certain kinds of dishes. That couldn't be more true for quail, which has always been a luxury order both in the current day and in the past. It's just not something you get for cheap, and when you add on sweet roasted grapes to the platter, then you only increase the ambiance of the dish that much more. I like to affectionately refer to it as mansion food because, well, it just looks like what you'd find in a mansion. Ironically enough, it was actually something you'd have found on the tables of most upper-class families back then, so it's not like only the uber elite got to taste some quail. You just definitely had to be well off. Quail isn't as inaccessible as it used to be, but it's definitely not really a hotly demanded item anymore either, outside of gourmet dining circles. Cabbage slaw with boiled dressing provided crisp, tangy freshness on Thanksgiving tables when lettuce was expensive or unavailable during November's cold weather months. A head of cabbage was shredded finely by hand using sharp knives or box graters, creating thin strips that filled large bowls generously. The boiled dressing was made by cooking together vinegar, sugar, a beaten egg, and a little flour until thickened and smooth, then cooling it before tossing with the raw cabbage. Some cooks added grated carrots or chopped apples when available, stretching the slaw further while adding color and nutrition. The result was crunchy, sweet-sour, and refreshing, providing textural contrast to soft, rich holiday foods. A single head of cabbage cost less than 20 cents and made enough slaw to feed 12 people when dressed properly. The boiled dressing used less oil than mayonnaise-based versions, saving money while still providing creamy coating. Vegetarian chili definitely had its heyday in the same time as those moments I was talking about. Listen, when I say movement, I don't mean a 3-day bandwagon full of peaceful sit-ins and protests like we have today. I mean, like nationally, parents everywhere were livid. They couldn't stand that their kids were actually preferring to stay inside with a McDonald's Happy Meal and the television screen, and lots of them became super proactive about their family's diet and eating habits because of the massive revamp in culture. I mean, in this same century, these people went from surviving off of foraging wild mushrooms to watching moving pictures on a screen, having a magic box that just cools all their food full-time, slow cookers, the internet, computers, and God knows what else. All this to say, it was a fast-paced era, and people reacted with what they knew worked: vegetables. If the Depression proved anything, it was that there was a massive problem with people's diets. It wasn't economical, and it definitely wasn't healthy, and the alternative wasn't as impossible to switch to as most people would have you believe. Circumstances like this saw the rise of vegetarian chili and vegan cookbooks, but unfortunately, it couldn't make the cut, especially in the South, where people just outright rejected it. You know, guys back in the day used to hunt feral pigs and make wild boar shoulder roasts out of them. Nowadays, they listen to Andrew Tate. You gotta start wondering where we went wrong with everything. No, but really, wild boar shoulder roasts were a thing. And not only were they a thing with a lot of historical and culinary reference. So basically, a super important thing. The dish was a heritage of regional cooking that blended the best and most practical parts of Southern and Native American influences. Wild boars aren't something that were native to America, and indigenous people were the ones who were the most proficient hunters. They were also the ones who did the most experimenting and found out that things like smoking and roasting work really well here. You might think, but if they aren't native, how come so many are there in the South? Well, that has to do with how boars were introduced by Spanish explorers in the 1500s. Basically, those boars had escaped into the southern side of the country, and that's why you see so many in the South. Wild boar became a sign of bounty and became associated with feasts, holidays, and eventually roasts. But we've really moved away from hunting as a country. Biscuit rolls replaced expensive yeast rolls on Thanksgiving tables, using quick biscuit dough shaped into elegant crescents that looked festive and special despite costing almost nothing to prepare. Flour, baking powder, salt, and lard were cut together with a pastry blender until the mixture resembled coarse crumbs. Then just enough milk was added to form soft dough that could be rolled out thin on floured kitchen counters. The dough was cut carefully into triangles, rolled up tightly from the wide end toward the point, and curved gently into crescent shapes before being placed on baking sheets and baked until golden brown and puffed. The rolls emerged from the oven hot and flaky, their buttery layers pulling apart easily when broken open at the table, steam rising from the soft interior. Families brushed them immediately with melted margarine while still warm, creating an attractive shine and adding richness that made them look more expensive than they actually were. Now, I'll tell you what worked in the South and everywhere else. Fried bologna sandwiches. Hey, even the vegans had to reconsider. If you can't beat them, join them, right? No, seriously, these sandwiches were just that good. I don't know if they made bologna better back in the day or if they just laced it with magic drugs, but people were addicted, and I mean bad. This was the working class meal, especially in rural areas. Bologna wasn't only just delicious, it was also insanely affordable and one of the easiest meat products you could ever hope to get. In a post-war America where meat prices still hadn't fully recovered and become what they used to be, bologna sandwiches were more or less a godsend for everyone in the country. A budget-friendly meal before your long, grueling shift with a dash of protein to save your day and nutritional needs. Frying the bologna was also something people deeply took to because of how much flair it would add overall. A simple slice of bologna and some bread slices became the saving grace of many people's days back in the 70s. Braised lamb shanks with mint sauce are also something that have a particularly long history in America, and this time, it's with an Irish spin. Now, before we talk about what inspired this, let's talk a bit about the shank in general. This fine cut of meat has always been underappreciated since it came from the lower leg of the animal and was a lot tougher. It was something the wealthy class looked down upon because it was a dish you had to work for. You know, kind of like crabs. The more tender and soft meat was, the easier it was to eat, the more it would be associated with wealth. Lamb was also something that was really common in the 20th century throughout places like New England where a farming culture really thrived. This rustic dish was a big part of the nose-to-tail style of eating, where families would devour every part of an animal in the name of not wasting a single bit of it. Personally, I think that's pretty considerate and respectful. How do you feel about it, though? While you type it out, let me tell you a bit more about braised lamb shanks. They fell out of fashion because, in general, people just didn't appreciate the gamey taste of lamb too much as time went on, but they were considered a big Sunday roast staple for people who were born in homes with farming-oriented lifestyles. Green bean vinaigrette replaced expensive green bean casserole on budget-conscious Thanksgiving tables, using simple garden vegetables and pantry staples instead of costly cream and canned soup that strained budgets. Fresh or canned green beans were drained thoroughly and arranged attractively in serving dishes, then dressed generously with a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and salad oil, whisked together with salt and pepper until well blended. Thinly sliced onions were scattered over the top, their sharp flavor mellowing slightly in the acidic dressing as it sat. The result was bright, tangy, and refreshing, cutting through the richness of heavier holiday foods while providing vegetables that families needed for balanced nutrition. The dish could be served cold or at room temperature, eliminating the need for precious oven space or last-minute preparation during the busy holiday cooking rush. A pound of beans dressed with a quarter cup of vinaigrette fed 8 to 10 people as a substantial side dish. Grits with cheese were one of the staples of Southern eating and culture for the longest time before Americans moved on from cornmeal. Hey, I get it. I'd probably tire of it if it was one of the only things I grew up on. People were just used to eating corn in all of its forms, and cornmeal was one of the most popular and normalized ones. As a result, cornmeal grits were common in most homes. Breakfast, lunch, or dinner, it really didn't matter. People could honestly just walk into a diner and expect them to serve grits. You didn't even have to take a look at the menu since any roadside place worth its property value in salt would be serving one. Hell, they were easy enough to make at home. The cheese addition also made it a lot more palatable and made more Americans willing to try it. As far as Southern staples go, this one gets some use still, but only by old heads who remember the days of when you would have this for comfort food instead of a Big Mac and extra large fries. Okay, being honest with you, I want to pig out at these Sunday roasts as much as the next guy, but seriously, roasting an entire goose with prunes and chestnut stuffing? I think that's just bordering a little too close to gluttony, and I mean the biblical kind. It was supposedly a big sign of luxury, which no wonder. You must have been pretty loaded if this is what your idea of an average Sunday roast was back in the day. You might start to wonder what changed to turn this from a sign of luxury into what most people would call just teetering on the edge of an eating problem. Now, I'm definitely not one to judge, especially when your thing is going wild and eating like your favorite anime character, but I do think dialing it back to leaner and smaller portions wasn't a bad idea. Apparently, I'm not the only one with that idea. Lots of people in America began to notice that the country had some serious issues with eating and portion control. They wanted to make the eventual shift to a more balanced plate and an overall smaller one, and I think that's why stuff like having an entire goose for a family of 4 fell out of fashion. Depression dressing carried its name from the 1930s into 1960s kitchens where thrift remained essential for family survival. Day-old bread torn into chunks was mixed with diced onions, celery leaves that would otherwise be discarded, and just enough broth to moisten without making it soggy. The mixture contained no butter, no eggs, no expensive herbs beyond a pinch of dried sage saved from last year's garden. It was spread in shallow pans and baked until the top formed a golden crust while the interior stayed soft and savory, absorbing gravy beautifully. The dressing transformed humble bread into something that felt substantial and comforting on holiday tables. 6 slices of stale bread became enough dressing for 10 people when stretched with vegetables and liquid. The technique required attention, checking frequently to prevent burning while ensuring enough crispness developed. Home economists praised depression dressing as smart homemaking, teaching young wives how their grandmothers had survived harder times. Cornbread and beans are another one that we unfortunately just left behind in the 70s. Healthy eating like that looks and sounds real good on paper. And don't get me wrong, people find ways to make it work in real life and practical application too. I mean, it didn't get to being such a popular staple crop for no reason, you know? Unfortunately, people tend to get tired of what they become too codependent on. Corn was abused so much as a crop during the 20th century, whether it was the massive amounts of overfarming for big-time canning companies or whether it was the massive amounts of corn that people were farming and putting to use during the Depression. Suffice it to say that cornbread definitely wasn't something people were waking up excited for, at least not well into the 2000s, when they were exposed to so many options from other cultures. Beans are still a regional favorite, and in the South, there's still a deep-found appreciation for cultural foods like black beans. They just don't really make the front of the cookbook anymore, you know? Yorkshire pudding stuffed chicken is a really imaginative dish. It's something that takes roasted chicken together with Yorkshire pudding, and while that really might be breaking too much away from tradition for some people, it's also a testament to how much of British cuisine America's really imported. Like it or not, I think we have a knack for European food if history is anyone to listen to. The idea to combine Yorkshire pudding with roasted chicken was something that worked out because of boredom. People wanted a twist on the typical British Sunday roast, and the pudding would typically be served on the side. This time around, it was used as a stuffing. The batter would soak up the juice entirely, and this enhanced the flavor of the meat and gave the pudding a new flavor entirely. It worked because of this flavor fusion, and despite how it's taken a bit of a backseat in recent times thanks to all kinds of new avenues available to people when it comes to fusion food, this variant of Yorkshire pudding and roasted chicken was definitely a really fun Sunday roast meal. Sweet potato pudding transformed the year's cheapest and most abundant vegetable into Thanksgiving dessert that satisfied sweet cravings without requiring expensive sugar or fancy ingredients that strained family budgets. Boiled sweet potatoes were mashed until completely smooth and mixed thoroughly with beaten eggs, a small amount of sugar or molasses for sweetness, ground cinnamon for warmth, and enough milk to create a pudding consistency that would set properly when baked. The mixture was poured carefully into buttered baking dishes and baked in moderate ovens until set firm and lightly browned on top, filling kitchens throughout the neighborhood with the spicy sweetness of cinnamon and caramelizing sugars. The pudding could be served warm, straight from the oven, or cooled and served cold the next day, either plain or topped with a small dollop of whipped cream if the budget allowed such luxury. Sweet potatoes cost only pennies per pound in the 1960s markets. One of the soups that took off during the 1970s was stuffed cabbage soup. Remember how I said people really became besties with cabbage overall? Yeah, that meant that they were exploring its potential in every avenue of food known to the average American Joe. You had cabbage casseroles, cabbage stir-fries, cabbage stews, and now stuffed cabbage soup. I mean, on the one hand, it was boring as anything could be, and it really needed a lot of aromatics and seasonings to become something you could justify spending time on. On the other hand, it was dirty cheap, like unfairly cheap. And for some people, it was just free. That's right. If you had your own farmland with a crop-growing culture in your family, then you were likely raised growing cabbage, or at least having it in the home a lot. In rural areas, low-income ones and urban ones, for different reasons, whether it was the economics of it at all or the fact that modern American consumerism as they knew it was slowly heading to massive health problems for all participants, people flew like moths to cabbage soup. Roasted capon with sage butter is a bit of a shocker. Basically, it's a castrated rooster that was raised purely for slaughter. This used to be a centerpiece dish for everything related to Sunday roast dinner, festivals, celebrations, and more. But slowly over time, this kind of stuff really went out of fashion. The rooster has to be castrated at a young age, and the reason they do this is because then they don't really produce testosterone anymore. As a result, the bird tends to grow larger, with a bigger fat content and more tender meat. Capons became a symbol of luxury exactly because of these qualities. They were seen as a superior bird with a lot of richness. There was also the fact that the overall taste just wasn't that gamey, which honestly made it fit so many people's palates. This entire practice of caponizing a rooster is something that first started in ancient Rome, and there are even agricultural texts that describe the process. From there, it found its way to Europe, and naturally, they eventually brought it over to us. You can expect a buttery flavor and a very, very crispy skin and tender inside, but thanks to industrial poultry farming and changing tastes, even these outstanding qualities couldn't keep it in the game forever. Water gravy transformed basic ingredients into sauce that made dry meat and plain dressing taste like abundance for budget-conscious families. The technique started with whatever fat was available, usually bacon grease or meat drippings, heated in cast iron until shimmering and ready. Flour was whisked in slowly, creating a roux that cooked until golden and nutty smelling, the foundation of all good gravy. Then came water, added gradually while stirring constantly to prevent lumps from forming, along with salt, pepper, and sometimes a splash of kitchen bouquet for deeper color and flavor. The gravy simmered until it thickened enough to coat the back of a spoon, becoming smooth and rich despite containing no stock, no wine, no cream. Families poured it generously over everything on their plates, the hot sauce bringing moisture and flavor to economical foods that needed help. Cookbook authors acknowledged that while broth made better gravy, water gravy kept families fed when resources ran low during difficult times. So it's pretty much the same deal with chili con carne. It used to be known as chili with meat and was extremely popular in the 70s, but it ran out of luck. Despite how it was used to being known as the quintessential American comfort food, it was just something that stagnated. In Texas and the southwestern areas of the United States, it was arguably the most popular it had ever been. Canned chili brands such as Wolf and Hormel also made it really easy for people to make stuff like this, and you had every beginner-friendly recipe available in cookbooks all over libraries, magazines, shops, and just anywhere, really. Chili con carne, for these reasons, managed to stay pretty relevant despite entering the game fairly late. It evolved into a lot of different variations and styles because not everyone has the South's preference for diarrhea and inflamed mouths, but it was seen as healthy, or at least it had the potential to be. Vegetarians even started pushing their own plant-based substitutes for the meat elements in the dish instead. I think chili bowls and canned chili in general are just falling out, it seems like these days. People go for more tamer flavors. Rabbits and white wine sauce were a funny thing. Ideally, there's probably nothing more gourmet than being served something like this. A fancy European-style white wine sauce with a perfectly tender and juicy rabbit. It just sounds like rich people food, you know? Which is why I wonder if you'll be surprised when you find out that rabbits actually weren't all that expensive or luxurious to get. Nowadays, you can get away with passing a rabbit dish as a gourmet experience depending on the skill of the chef and the complexity of the dish. Back then, though, we were just talking about Sunday roasts. Arguably, cooking the white wine sauce was harder than the rabbit here. Still, the culture of eating rabbits is something that I think began in the Great Depression. People were so low on game, chicken, and just sources of meat that they began to hunt, and rabbits were one of the most abundant resources available. I think from there on, lots of people, especially hunter families in the South, rediscovered a newfound appreciation for rabbit and its soft, buttery flavors. Pumpkin soup from canned pumpkin gave families an elegant first course that cost almost nothing, yet impressed guests with its golden color and smooth, velvety texture. A single can of pumpkin puree was thinned with milk or water, seasoned generously with salt, pepper, and a pinch of nutmeg, then heated slowly while stirring constantly to prevent scorching on the bottom. The soup was poured into bowls and served warm, sometimes garnished with a sprinkle of dried parsley saved from summer gardens. The flavor was earthy and mildly sweet, preparing palates for the heavier foods to follow while providing warmth and nourishment on cold November afternoons. Home economists promoted this soup as sophisticated entertaining on a budget, showing housewives that they could serve multiple courses without spending beyond their means. The canned pumpkin that cost 35 cents stretched into soup for 8 people when properly diluted and seasoned, making it remarkably economical for struggling families. Something else that was also insanely popular and stopped being that way was oven-baked chicken drumsticks. This is also something I will entirely, and many food analysts and critics will agree with me on, fast food. See, why would you ever bother with the laborious process of marinating drumsticks, gathering the ingredients, making up a spice blend, making a sauce, making a dip, cutting up fries, and going to the store for some affordable soda when Kentucky Fried Chicken has a deal out for a 3-piece combo for $10? Is $10 outrageous for a 3-piece combo? Most assuredly. Is KFC still undoubtedly delicious, convenient, and deeply ingrained into the American cultural zeitgeist? Absolutely. It's not even that there aren't any benefits to making this stuff at home. There are an insane amount of arguments and good reasons as to why it is healthier, smarter, and more economical to just handle your cravings at home with an air fryer, some olive oil or vegetable oil, and drumsticks you can trust. People don't work like that, though. And unfortunately, the saying that humans are creatures of habit couldn't be any more true. People are far too hooked on fast food chains for their supply of fried food, especially classic things like drumsticks. And that just means that ovens don't see a lot of use outside of TikTok trends and one-off videos that content creators might do. Herb-stuffed guinea hens were another kind of meat that had an extremely fascinating history overall in America. They were something that was cherished by the population for how sustainable they were and the specific flavor of the meat, which would just work the best overall with roasting. It was a blend of African and rural American traditions that brought the best out of this dish. See, when I say African influences, I don't want to discredit the amount of work they actually put in here. Guinea hens were something that were always native to Africa, and when prisoners were brought on over thanks to the transatlantic slave trade, they brought on over along with them all of their cooking expertise. To them, guinea hens were a deep-rooted connection to their heritage. Can't say I blame them either. It's pretty human to find pieces of your home wherever you go, isn't it? Speaking of homes, lots of households actually dedicated themselves to farming and raised guinea hens. Now, besides the taste palette of America just changing a lot in the past few years, guinea hens have also not been the most popular farm animal in the past years, with more people investing in cattle thanks to beef production and how profitable that industry is. Thank you, McDonald's. Cornstarch pudding gave families an economical dessert alternative when eggs and milk for custard cost more than budgets allowed during lean Thanksgiving seasons. Cornstarch was mixed with sugar, a pinch of salt, and whatever flavoring was available, vanilla extract if affordable, or simply cinnamon and nutmeg from the spice cabinet. Cold milk was stirred in gradually to prevent lumps, then the mixture was cooked slowly on the stovetop, stirring constantly until it thickened into smooth, creamy pudding that coated the spoon. The pudding was poured into individual serving dishes and chilled until set, sometimes topped with a sprinkle of cinnamon or a few raisins for decoration. The texture was surprisingly luxurious despite humble ingredients, smooth and rich on the tongue. A single box of cornstarch costing 15 cents could make enough pudding to serve 8 people as dessert, making it one of the most economical sweet endings possible. Spam fried rice and the question of its immediate availability really are something that you would have to think about region to region. In Hawaii, in 2025, I guess, yeah, you could find places that were doing it, or really just make it yourself with any cheap brand of Spam. Everywhere else, though? It hasn't been such a good century for pineapples, really. The anti-pineapple propaganda press has never eased up entirely, at least not since pineapple pizzas were the next big laughingstock of the internet in the 2010s. While the days of hating on things like that are far in the past too, the general divisiveness on pineapples and therefore Spam hasn't really gone. Spam fried rice struggles to find a place for itself among today's menus of vegan-friendly food, fusion food from a mix of 3 different cuisines and cultures, fast food, convenience food, and all the other options that overwhelm our budgets and minds daily. In all of that, why look towards that lonely little can of Spam and a bag of rice? There are killer delis just down the corner, you know? And they deliver. Have you ever been around for Passover or Rosh Hashanah? If you're Jewish, you know what I'm talking about right from the get-go. If you're not, for some cultural context, the next item on our list, stuffed breast of veal, is actually something that you see a lot of in Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine. It was something that Jewish immigrants started to bring on over to America as well, sometime during the 19th and 20th centuries. Veal was actually on the opposite end of the spectrum in this time period too. People actually didn't consider it luxurious at all, and it would even be something that was really affordable for the working class. Loads of European immigrants also eventually came along, and the whole stuffing aspect was something they imparted onto the dish. You'll see a lot of that in America. You get a dish from one corner of the world, and it ends up going through 5 different makeovers because, well, what don't we have here, culturally speaking? It's just one big melting pot, which makes it hard for things to stay in the public's eye for too long. These 25 dishes did not vanish because the counter cooks forgot how to make them. They vanished because the country stopped meeting at counters. The mill shifts ended. The trucking routes ended at warehouse docks instead of roadside diners. The Pullman cars rusted, and the chrome stools went into auction lots. What surprised me, the deeper I looked, was how many of these dishes are kept alive by a single family in a single city. Tell us in the comments which counter in which town served the plate that fed your father and what year you sat at that counter and ate it last.